As a part of our tribute to Morris, we have a handout and no slides. Does everyone have the handout? Because you're going to need it. Okay. All right, I'll get started. You know, I'm the dean of the grad school at UMass, and a couple weeks ago, had to address all of the grad students, all the new grad students for the university. And so, of course, I talked about Morris. And one of the things I said about him turns out to be something that occurred to both Alan Prince and Mark Liberman as well, that at the time that we were students, Morris seemed very old. And, you know, he had no hair, and he was all gray, and he had a beard and all that. And then and now with the passage of time, I have come to realize that I am older now than he was then. In fact, the age he was then seems to me kind of young. All right, so the goal of this talk is we're going to talk about some notions about parallelism and serialism. So as I'm sure everyone here must know, an SPE grammar is a sequence of rules, and a derivation is a sequence of representations. Simultaneous application of rules is highly restricted. In fact, it's almost like a historical nicety that if you would happen to know that exchange rules and parenthesis star rules required simultaneous application. Parallel OT, so that's what we're going to call serialism. Parallel OT, a grammar, is a ranking of violable constraints, and a derivation is a sequence of two representations, underlying and surface or input and output. All processes apply simultaneously in gen, and all of their results are evaluated together. So that's parallelism. To date, comparisons of parallelism and serialism have primarily focused on phonological opacity, as in work by Bill Sardi and Morris himself and others. Now, post-SPE serialism does have constraints, but they are inviolable output constraints. So what this means is that there are actually two differences between post-SPE serialism with its constraints and OT. One is the differences is parallelism versus serialism, but the other difference is violability versus inviolability of constraints. We think we can learn more about the distinct contributions that are made by parallelism and viability in optimality theory by looking at a serial theory with violable constraints, harmonic serialism. Harmonic serialism is one of the many important ideas in Prince and Smolinski in 1993, and it's one that they generously left for others like us to explore. So our goal is going to be to show that some existing arguments for parallelism, including mainly ones that we have made, do not carry over to a serial theory with violable constraints, that is, harmonic serialism. So this is going to be a defense of serialism. We're not going to actually be arguing for harmonic serialism today. We've done that elsewhere, and there's some references there if you want to carry that exploration forward. This is drawn from some work that we have in a paper to appear. Cross-level, now the empirical material we'll be looking at is called cross-level interactions. Okay? A cross-level interaction is a phonological generalization that has to be stated in a way that refers to more than one level of the prosodic hierarchy. Some of the top-down effects that Matt Gordon talked about later would be probably classified as cross-level interactions. One that I think is known to almost everyone from Armin Mester's '94 paper is iambic shortening in Latin, where words of an iambic form, that is a light, heavy syllable, shorten the second syllable in order to make a good trochee. An example, that's an instance of a cross-level interaction because it refers both to foot and Moraic structure. Why are cross-level interactions interesting? Well, because in the literature by us and Cogger, Mester, and Prince and Smolinski, cross-level interactions are offered as crucial evidence for parallelism because they do seem to require changing structure at two different levels of the prosodic hierarchy simultaneously. So in the Latin case, it seems to require building a foot and shortening a vowel in parallel. I'll read the quote from Cogger here because I think it's quite pertinent. Parallelism establishes complete communication between all levels of the prosodic hierarchy. Consequently, changes at lower prosodic levels have effects at higher levels, and vice versa. A serial analysis of the Latin facts has to shorten the vowel and build the foot in separate steps. But shortening before foot building is unmotivated, and foot building before shortening requires that you build an ill-formed trochee at an intermediate stage of the derivation. We're going to argue here, though, that it's not really parallelism versus serialism that's at issue, but violability versus inviolability. That, in fact, you do go through an intermediate stage with that ill-formed trochee because the constraint against that trochee is, although surface unviolated, is a violable constraint, and it is indeed violated in an intermediate stage of the derivation. Now, in view of the event that we're attending today, and also because it's a useful prelude to what we'll be doing, we're going to look back at the cross-level interactions in early rule and constraint theories, starting with Kisseberth, 1970. We're going to show that cross-level interactions do indeed present serious issues for these theories, but only if they operate with inviolable constraints. We'll look first at blocking and then at triggering. So Kisseberth defines blocking as the rule should apply, but it can't apply because its output would be in violation of a derivational constraint, basically a phonotactic requirement. Similarly, Liberman and Prince, no rule may apply so as to produce an ill-formed representation. So, for example, metrical theories of word stress show lots of these blocking effects. Parsing of syllables into feet is exhaustive, but foot binarity can block you from parsing a lone light syllable into a foot. We see this, for example, in Hayes's analysis of Hixkaryana. So this is a language with left to right iambs, final extrametricality, and no degenerate feet. If you have an even parity sequence of light syllables before the final syllable, as in 3a, then you get full parsing modulo the extrametricality. But if you have an odd parity sequence of light syllables before the final, parsing is incomplete, and as you see, the underlying syllable remains unparsed. That's a blocking effect mediated by foot binarity. Now, triggering. Triggering was perhaps first recognized by Sommerstein in a 1974 paper, and he had the idea that rules could be somehow positively motivated by constraints. I won't read his definition, which is a bit much, but just the idea is that the rule has to, the constraint violation has to trigger the rule, which in a sense repairs the violation of that constraint. An instance of this can again be drawn from Hayes's analysis of Hixkaryana with the so-called unstressable word syndrome. Disyllabic words have only one intrametrical syllable, and so even if that syllable is light, it has to get a foot, and that foot will have to be heavy. So there's a lengthening process. So the vowel lengthening rule, insert amora, is triggered by foot binarity in the derivation in 6, a la Sommerstein. Okay. The problem is that in 6, the footing rule introduces a violation of foot binarity, which the vowel lengthening rule repairs. So if constraints are inviolable, why wasn't the footing rule simply blocked? Well, the intuition, but that never reaches sort of formal expression in the work of this era, is that the existence of the lengthening process somehow temporarily licenses the violation of foot binarity because you know you can fix it up in the next step. And that notion that you can fix it up comes up in these theories that we could call relaxed serialism, such as Mester, Myers, Paladin, and others. Okay, so the idea here is that some rules are recast as repairs. They're a different species of thing, and the repairs apply in parallel with the rules to bring the output of a rule into conformity with the inviolable constraints. So lengthening in Hixkaryana or shortening in Latin would be examples of repairs that are triggered by a foot building process that produces a temporarily ill-formed foot. The problem is that why is the lengthening repair not available when parsing an odd parity sequence of light syllables before the final, as in the Hixkaryana example there, right? And why can't we shorten elsewhere in Latin in order to produce fuller footings? So shortening a heavy penult to get anti-penult stress with a better foot there. Well, descriptively, these repairs are only available when a word would otherwise remain unfooted or have a lone degenerate foot, but not when more complete footing is at stake. But that observation remains kind of outside the scope of the analysis. There's another problem is that lengthening in Hixkaryana is also triggered by the stress to weight principle, and that's why you see in 7 you get iambic lengthening, a typical case of that, okay? So the lengthening repair is associated with the foot parsing rule in Hixkaryana, but only in certain situations. The repair of light iambs and the unstressable word syndrome, and not others, such as the parsing of odd parity sequences. The extant theories do not seem to do a good job of accounting for that state of affairs. And this is certainly not an isolated example. Another approach that was entertained very briefly by Kisseberth and never really worked out was the idea that there might be some notion of violability, that rules could be relatively obligatory. But again, this doesn't really help you address the kinds of problems that we're looking at here. So to sum up, this earlier work was generally successful in identifying the problems that you need to deal with in cross-level interactions, but it was a good deal less successful in handling the range of blocking and triggering effects that are found cross-linguistically in cross-level interactions. Now, Catherine will take over.
In general, cross-level interactions don't present the same kind of problem in parallel OT, and that's principally because Gen produces candidates which can show the effects of more than one operation at a time. In this case, what we'll be looking at is lengthening and foot building once again. We can demonstrate parallel OT's success with CLIs with Kager's analysis of Hixkaryana. So again, to summarize the Hixkaryana facts, there are 3 crucial input-output mappings that must be accounted for, and these are analyzed in 9, 10, and 11. In 9 is the case of the potentially unstressable word. So because of non-finality, a disyllabic foot's impossible, but a degenerate foot on the initial syllable is dispreferred by foot binarity. So a violation of det mora is tolerated in order to satisfy the top rank constraints, including a constraint which requires the prosodic word to have some head, that is at least 1 foot. Another case is the case of iambic lengthening, and this is shown in 10. So simultaneously, we can lengthen and foot in order to get the light heavy iambs that we really want. In those cases, as shown in 10, again, we tolerate a violation of det mora in order to do that. And in 11, then the third case are the cases where there are an odd number of sequences, an odd number of syllables before the final. So that's what's meant by odd parity sequences here. And in these are the cases where we see underparsing. That is, we see an initial foot and 2 syllables go unparsed. Candidate A wins here. Even though there's underparsing, the alternatives are worse. So full parsing is in danger of violating foot binarity or non-finality. Or potentially, if the same, as seen in the candidate 11b, the same kind of repair doesn't seem to be available for the larger word in 11 as it is in the smaller word in 9. And Kager's analysis accounts for this with a definition of uneven iamb that prefers light heavy iambs even over heavy syllable iambs. So it's clear that parallel OT can formalize this situation with interacting constraints and processes in multiple levels. Blocking and triggering in this case are just the familiar consequences of constraint interaction in parallel OT. All right, so what we're ultimately going to be arguing here, though, is that although in this analysis it appears that the simultaneity of the operations is really what allows the proper formalization, it's possible to get a formalization of cross-level interactions even without assuming parallelism, that is within a serial theory. And the crucial thing is that the constraints must be violable, as in standard optimality theory. The theory that we're working in is harmonic serialism. Harmonic serialism is a derivational version of optimality theory. There are 2 main differences from the standard version of parallel optimality theory. One is what we call gradualness, which is that the gen of harmonic serialism is limited to making just 1 change at a time. So the candidate set features a finite set of candidates that differ in at most 1 way from the local input. And the second difference is that there is a loop that occurs between gen and eval. Gen creates a set of candidates, eval selects the optimal one according to the constraint hierarchy. But as we know, phonological inputs and surface forms often differ in multiple ways, so the grammar must iterate in order to see the effects of multiple changes. The derivation continues until convergence, and convergence is technically defined when the input to a particular iteration results is essentially chosen as the optimal output again. That is, when a faithful candidate wins, that's a signal that no other changes are going to improve harmony according to the constraint ranking. The constraint ranking stays the same throughout the derivation. Okay. As far as gradualness goes, of course, gradualness is a kind of proposal. That is, it's a theory of gen. The assumptions that we'll make today will make explicit, but obviously it's not something that we necessarily know in advance. It's a research question, what counts as gradual. All right, so the analysis of cross-level interactions in harmonic serialism involves two properties that are important and that we're talking about today. The one that I'll mostly be talking about is violation of the surface true. So there are rankings in harmonic serialism where a derivation introduces and later eliminates violations of a constraint which is otherwise unviolated. That is, on the surface, all the surface forms satisfy this constraint. One example is the Latin case where an LH foot has to be built in order to see that the shortening needs to happen. So we tolerate the poor LH trochee for a time, even though on the surface there are no LH trochees. The second key property of HS analysis of CLIs, which Joe will be talking about in a moment, is full availability of structural operations. So that's that harmonic serialism is not bottom-up. Structure is not built in a strictly bottom-up fashion. Conditions arising at later stages of a derivation can demand revision of structure that's inherited from earlier stages. So again, with the Latin example, although we've built syllables, a light syllable followed by a heavy syllable, and we've built a foot on top of that, it doesn't prevent us from going back and revising our syllable analysis, in this case by deleting a mora. And we argue that because it inherits OT's violable constraints, harmonic serialism offers a successful and fully formalized solution to the problem of how constraints and operations interact in derivation. This is a problem that couldn't be solved in earlier serial theories that combined rules with inviolable constraints. So our analysis of Hixkaryana and harmonic serialism, again, has to deal with the same three crucial input-output mappings. We'll assume just two operations are going to be pertinent here. One is lengthening. We can insert a mora on any vowel. And the second is footing. We can parse any pair of adjacent syllables into a headed binary foot or a single unfooted syllable into a unary foot. So the first case is the unstressable word syndrome case, disyllable with two light syllables. The first step of this derivation takes the two light syllables as input, considers candidates with a unary foot, candidates with a binary foot, candidates with no parsing, and then a candidate with lengthening but no parsing. Again, each of those candidates differs in one way from the input. In step one, as shown in 13, candidate A wins. That is, we tolerate this degenerate foot at this stage of the derivation because it's the best we can do. It satisfies non-finality. It satisfies having a head in the prosodic word. It doesn't satisfy foot binarity, but that's lower ranked than the other two. It doesn't satisfy stress to weight, but again, it's lower ranked. So one thing we have to assume here is, in order for this to work, is that the first foot can be given the status of the headed prosodic word. So that's important. All right, so step two is shown in 14. Step two takes as its input the output to step one, that is the disyllable with an initial degenerate foot, and it considers candidates that do nothing, that's 14b, candidate that adds another foot, that's 14c, and then a candidate that lengthens, and that's 14a, and that's the winner here. And it does this in order to satisfy foot binarity, the foot binarity violation that was introduced at the previous step. Example 15, which is step 3, just shows convergence. So this shows you that the input and the output match in this case. The faithful candidate is chosen, so no matter how many times you ran this evaluation, you'd always get the same thing. So that's a signal that the derivation converges. Okay, so the second thing we need to account for is the iambic lengthening cases. We illustrate this with a candidate that has an even number of syllables before the extra metrical final syllable. So in step one here, we build an iambic foot, 16a. This gives the word a prosodic head, and it also satisfies parse syllable better than not footing at all. In step two, we add an additional foot because parse syllable is the next most important thing to satisfy modulo foot binarity and non-finality. In 18, then, we lengthen one of the stressed syllables, 18a. So even though we've tolerated an LL foot, we don't want that to persist to the surface because that introduced a violation of stress to weight. We get rid of that violation by tolerating a violation of dep mora, because stress to weight dominates dep mora. And then finally, step 4, which is not shown, involves the lengthening of that second foot in just the same way that the first foot was lengthened. All right, and the third case that we have to account for are the cases where there's an odd number of syllables before the extrametrical final syllable. And these are the cases of underparsing. So what we find is that the first two syllables are parsed into an iambic foot. The pen initial syllable is lengthened in accordance with stress to weight. And then there's underparsing. The third syllable doesn't get parsed. And it forms a kind of contrast with the unstressable word cases like the input kana. So we skip step one. There's no tableau showing step one, which just builds an iambic foot. But step two is shown in 19. Here we have the input iambic foot, and we have the choice of adding a monosyllabic foot, adding another iambic foot, or lengthening the stress syllable of the foot we have. And here we select lengthening. We don't select 19b, even though that was the comparable solution for the input disyllable. And the reason is that head prosodic word is already satisfied. Head prosodic word was the constraint that really motivated the building of the initial degenerate foot in the disyllable case, but it's already satisfied here, and parsyllable is ranked below foot binarity, so we don't egregiously generate degenerate feet. As a result, a candidate with a lengthened penult in these cases never actually emerges in the derivation. It's never a candidate. Step three of this form just in 20 illustrates convergence. Again, the input matches the output. It's the best we can do. Okay, so cross-level interactions in harmonic serialism, more in general, present the problem of temporary intermediate stage violations of constraints that are otherwise surface unviolated. Repair theories and parallel OT address the problem of this with simultaneity. You can fix the violation at the same time that you create it, essentially. But harmonic serialism takes a different tack. So relying on OT's constraint ranking and violability, we can make sense of temporary intermediate stage violation of constraints that are surface unviolated. So in the kana case, we tolerate the degenerate foot and then lengthen it. In the case with the even number of syllables before the final, we tolerate LL iams before we lengthen them to LH iams. And then in the odd parity sequence before the final, the underparsing occurs because parsyllables rank below foot binarity. Okay. So this basically solves the problem of blocking and repair. The constraint ranking chooses the best way of satisfying foot binarity in the given context, whether it's not footing at all when headedness prosodic word is already satisfied, or by lengthening when non-finality and headedness have forced the creation of a degenerate foot. So in harmonic serialism, surface true constraints can be temporarily violated for the same reason that in parallel OT constraints can be active but violated. That is, domination of a constraint doesn't entail complete inactivity, and in HS, temporary violation of surface unviolated constraints is controlled by the grammar in the same way that parallel OT controls violation of surface violated constraints.
So far we've been emphasizing that serialism and constraint violability are compatible, and we've shown that some problems posed by cross-level interactions for serial theories with inviolable constraints disappear once inviolability is relaxed. But besides having inviolable constraints, the second key property of harmonic serialism for dealing with cross-level interactions that Catherine mentioned is that of full availability of structural operations throughout the derivation. And by this we mean that operations on lower levels of the prosodic hierarchy are not strictly ordered to apply before operations on a higher level. In Hixkaryana, for example, we saw that operations of vowel lengthening and foot construction were applying to construct candidates that competed in a single tableau at a single step of the derivation. So there's a sort of parallelism within a step of a derivation in this theory. And this is important because some arguments for parallelism are arguments against what is called bottom-up constructionism, in which lower levels of the structure are built before higher levels and cannot be revised later. Because harmonic serialism isn't bottom-up constructionism, these aren't arguments against harmonic serialism, and therefore they're not arguments against serialism in general. We're going to focus on arguments that we've made of this type ourselves, John and I have, which happen to be both about English stress and English prosody. And I guess since I've mentioned English stress, I might as well state the obvious fact that we're particularly indebted to Morris Halle's work with his collaborators on this topic. The first case involves prosodic conditions on the distribution of full and reduced variants of function words. Now I'm at 21 on the handout. In general, monosyllabic prepositions like to are reduced phrase medially, but are stressed phrase finally. So unstressed phrase medial, John spoke to Bill. Stressed phrase final, who did John speak to, or who did John speak to yesterday? Speaking of being indebted to earlier work, we're going to be just adopting Selkirk's analysis both in parallelity and in seriality. The main point that we're going to be making here is that less changes when you move to a serial theory than you might think that we had thought before. We've given all of the details of the analysis in the handout, but I'd like to draw your attention in particular to the constraint in 20. The constraint in 24, which penalizes parsing of function words into prosodic words. So this is the constraint that says that function words do not want to be prosodic words on their own. If you turn to 26, this P word constraint is the one that's ruling out stressed to in 26b. In case you haven't figured this out already, angled brackets are showing phrase boundaries. And so the winner in 26a, the optimal form in 26a, is one that satisfies the top rank constraint against parsing this foot, even though it ends up violating the lower rank exhaustivity constraint. When a function word is phrase final, however, prosodic word, the P word con conflicts with the constraints in 27 and 28, which want to have a prosodic word at the end of a phrase. And so now if we look at the tableau in 29, we'll see that the optimal form has the stressed to, because to is in phrase final position. And you might compare, in particular, 29a to 29c. That's a case when we've left the function word unparsed, and that violates the constraint demanding the prosodic word at the right edge of the phrase. So this is what you might call a top-down effect. Whether a function word is parsed as a prosodic word depends on where it's situated in the phonological phrase, which is the next level of structure above the prosodic word. And this would be a problem for serial theory if there is a strict ordering between prosodic word construction and prosodic phrase construction, such that prosodic word building could never follow prosodic phrase building. This is not a necessary property of all serial theories, and it's not a property of harmonic serialism in particular. And so if you turn to page 11 now, this is where we provide the harmonic serialist version of Selkirk's analysis. It works essentially the same way, except that we're building words one by one and building the phrase as a separate step of the derivation. And I'm just going to skip ahead now to 36 and 37 on page 12. If you want to look at the details at your leisure, please do later. But the main thing to point out here is that at 36, we've reached the stage of the derivation where we've built our two prosodic words on the lexical words, the good places to build prosodic words in general. And then now we've also got our phrase boundaries around speak and to, and our constraint that wants the right edge of the phrase to have a prosodic word now forces us to build a foot around on to, and the derivation will then converge. So again, this is a top-down effect. The presence of the phonological phrase is forcing the creation of a prosodic word where none was required previously. And from this, it should be clear that harmonic serialism isn't strictly bottom-up. And so McCarthy's argument for parallel OT based on Selkirk's analysis is an argument against strictly bottom-up derivations and not an argument against serialism per se. And right. So we'll now turn to another case. This is the one from my own paper. This involves what's called sonorant distressing in English, and we're just going to look at a couple instances of this, one particular context, in fact. So this is the context, the immediate pre-tonic context, when you have another syllable before the syllable at issue. So we're looking at the medial syllable here. And when that syllable ends in an obstruent, it's regularly stressed in forms like Timbuktu. But when it ends in a sonorant, it's regularly unstressed, and the sonorant is in nuclear position. So the special behavior of sonorants here is traditionally attributed to a role of sonorant de-stressing. This is you might have noticed that distressing is autocorrect strikes again. But in terms of the cross-linguistic typology, sonorant de-stressing seems a little odd. Because usually when there are differences between consonants in their propensity for adding weight to a syllable, it's the sonorants rather than the obstruents that add weight. So the sonorant final syllables typically act as more heavy than the obstruent final syllables. But I think that the English facts can be understood in terms of another property of English, and that's that the sonorants can occupy nuclear positions. So if they're in the nucleus, then they don't contribute weight to the syllable. And they don't violate weight to stress if they're in the weak branch, or quantity sensitivity if they're in the weak branch of a foot. And so that's how the analysis in parallel OT works. A constraint against clash and the weight to stress constraint force the sonorant into the nucleus. And in the case where you have the obstruent final syllable, you have to foot that syllable because you can't put the obstruent into a nucleus. All right, so I take this to be a chicken and egg problem because, I did take this to be a chicken and egg problem because it seemed like in order to figure out syllabification, you have to know the foot structure. In order to figure out what to do with foot structure, you have to know the syllabification possibilities, and so it seemed more straightforward to do these both at once. But again, harmonic serialism is not bottom-up serialism, and all operations are available at each step of the derivation. So if we had Gorgonzola as the input to some intermediate step of the derivation, then Jen can produce candidates like Gorgonzola and Gorgonzola, one of which changes the syllabification, the other which changes the stress. And we show this as a step of a harmonic serialist derivation in 42, where we've got, the last time I showed you where we had two words in place and we added a third prosodic word. Now we've got 2 feet in place and we're deciding what to do with this stray syllable. I have to say, though, that in this case there really are some non-trivial details to work out in terms of the operations that are producing the candidate set here. So what I've done with this tableau is assume that at the same time as you put the nucleus into as you put the sonorant into the nucleus of the syllable, you can adjoin to a foot. You might be able to also just do this as a two-step derivation of having the nucleus putting the sonorant into the nucleus and then adjoining it, or maybe just leaving it unfooted. The only way we can really figure out the right way of doing this is to do a full-on analysis of English, which we haven't done yet, and also to consider the implications of our decisions about the way that Jen is working for the typology. This will be some work, but I think there's a good motivation for doing that work, and that's that it looks to me like a serialist analysis of English can solve what seemed to me to be an insuperable problem in my earlier analysis of English that Bill Sardi actually pointed out to me, and which caused me lots of, I lost a lot of sleep after Bill pointed this out to me, because there's this problem that for words that have the shape HLL than the main stress, my analysis predicted that you should foot these as HLL, and that's not the attested footing. Turns out that this looks exactly like a problem that Catherine Pruitt was able to solve with generalized trochee languages in her 2010 paper. So in other words, it looks like it would be worth taking the time to work through a full analysis of English and harmonic serialism. So to sum up then, we said that there are 2 key properties of harmonic serialism that allow it to deal with cross-level interactions. One is constraint violability. The other is full available of structural operations throughout the derivation. The broader point that we'd like to draw is that serialism is a label that does apply to an extremely wide range of theories that differ greatly in the details of the implementation of a stepwise derivation. And when we're trying to figure out what the difference is between parallelism and serialism, those details really matter.
Alan Prince. So one of the reasons that we use the term bottom-up constructionism aside from trying to fool other people into saying the sequence, was that we knew perfectly well that you could handle these effects if you were allowed to freely do anything at any time in the hierarchy. So, okay, so what we wanted to do was simply restrict ourselves to a theory which you could talk about. Okay. Now, so the general question that I have then is, you know, the move that you're making is extremely interesting, and I like the idea of making, you know, the sort of generality of making all of the operations available at all times. But do we have a conception of what this means more generally than in dealing with particular examples that you have cited?
No.
Oh.
I'll elaborate. I was going to elaborate. I think there is some irreducible parallelism, and I think that the details of that are still not clear. That's why we don't have a general theory of this. So I can give you an example of irreducible parallelism. Take any case of the famous two-sided open syllable syncope process, okay? The basic understanding of two-sided open syllable syncope, that is syncope between VC and CV, is that you can resyllabify the result, right? So it must be the case that that resyllabification happens in parallel with the syncope process, right? Otherwise, you completely fail to capture that basic fact, okay? The Gorgonzola example was a more extreme case of this type. But I think that right now, you know, I think this is the big challenge for us, is to figure out the cases of irreducible parallelism and try to get some principled understanding of that. Does that sort of answer your question, or you were perhaps approaching it from the top down?
No. But I was interested in the extent to which you've investigated the effects, the general effects, the typological effects of making the assumption that you have made about the availability of operations.
Right. I mean, I think the place where the typological effects have been most thoroughly investigated is actually in Catherine's work. Well, you could tell what the operations are.
Yeah, well, so one case of irreducible parallelism that I can speak to and that I've worked out typological computations for is the case of assigning primary stress at the same time that you build your first foot. And there seem to be empirically some cases cases where the assignment of primary stress depends on primary stress-specific constraints. If you rely on secondary stress-specific constraints, you put feet in the wrong place to get primary stress where you want it. And I think by the time you put secondary stress down in the wrong place, it's a little bit too late. The available operations for changing an entire metrical structure seem a bit dubious. But Latin is a good example. So I think that was in Princeton-Smolinski an argument for parallelism, that Latin primary stress needs to be assigned before Latin secondary stress, or at least at the same time as you build the foot that you want to be the primary stress.
Yeah, I have something to say too.
Okay.
So one way of thinking about full availability of operations is to contrast that with the notion that operations apply strictly serially. And so one thing you lose with full availability is accounts of some cases of opacity. So a common misunderstanding about this version of harmonic serialism is it does opacity, but it doesn't do counter-bleeding opacity because of full availability. I could elaborate, but maybe, yeah.
So a theme of your talk, which I liked, was disposal of naive objections. Right, all of the cases you talked about look like they have this look-ahead character, but in every case, doing the analysis more carefully and looking at the constraint ranking shows that it's possible to have this analytical device of positing an intermediate stage that is, while strictly speaking ill-formed, is still a harmonic improvement. So that's right. That's what I take to be the theme here. The question I have, which is basically just tutorial for me, is that there are cases that have also been put forth as look-ahead, namely those emerging from Junko Ito's work in the 80s on epenthesis. That it's commonly observed that epenthesis has this teleological quality that you put the epenthetic vowels precisely where they will both permit syllabification of the output and minimize the number of epenthetic vowels. Now, if I recall from John's 2007 book, that actually has a different explanation in harmonic serialism, namely that syllabification is not considered to be a step. It isn't considered to be two steps to put in the vowel and syllabify the consonants. Would there be any way to generalize the method that you've put forth in this talk to cover the epenthesis cases?
Yeah, there's some work by, it's Emily, right? Emily Elfner, where she pursues the idea of building, a lot like Lisa's analysis with degenerate syllables as an intermediate step. So you can also imagine an analysis where the syllabification and epenthesis are separate steps, but you first have to produce the temporarily ill-formed, non-surface, well-formed degenerate syllable.